Hello everyone, this is Isaac White from the Crockett Tavern Museum here in Morristown, Tennessee. And before we dive into today's video, I sincerely want to apologize for the late uploads that you've been experiencing the past few weeks. If you follow along on Facebook, then you already know that it's been a crazy busy past couple of weeks, and almost as soon as I got back from my trip to Texas, it was right back to the grindstone, trying to push out orders as well as content. And well, unfortunately, last week we had some technical difficulties, not sure what that was all about, but then this week, for whatever reason, I guess my body is trying to tell me, you need to stop and rest. I have not been feeling 100% the whole week, but today is the best day I've felt, so in the interest of entertaining and educating you guys, well, I decided to make the trek to the tavern so we can do this week's video. With that being said, we invite y'all to come along as we discover the history of a fruit that is now known as the King of Pines. Now, of course, some of you have probably already figured out what fruit this is going to be, simply if you've seen the short or you've already looked at the thumbnail before you get into the video. Well, we're going to be talking about the pineapple, a fruit which was once so highly coveted that it led to a worldwide mania. This seems kind of far-fetched considering the availability of pineapples and their byproducts in grocery stores today, but at one point in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, it was so highly coveted that it was viewed more as a status symbol than an actual fruit, at least by European standards. So let's dive a little bit deeper into the history of that which is known as the Prince of Pines. Well, the best archaeological evidence we have available tells us that the pineapple was originally cultivated in South America. This, in particular, started to take place in Peru around 1200 to 800 BC, and then in Mexico from 200 BC to 700 AD, where it was cultivated by the Mayas and the Aztecs. By the late 1400s and the time of the European exploration into the New World, we see that pineapples were already widespread in their availability and considered a staple crop amongst Native American tribes. The first European to encounter this fruit was none other than Christopher Columbus, who encountered this fruit in Guadalupe on November 4th, 1493. As he made his way back to Spain, he took some of the fruits with him for cultivation and gave it the nickname of Piña de Indies, or Pine of the Indians. So with that being said, it might make you wonder, where in the world does the fruit get the name pineapple from? Well, this kind of comes about from a combination of things, you see, because this is a combination of the language of the indigenous people of Brazil, as well as the European explorer González Hernández Oviedo, who ended up giving it the name Pome de Piña, which is apple of pine. And obviously the pine part gets its name from the fact of the matter that the fruit in its appearance and shape kind of resembles that of a pine cone. The apple part actually comes from an interesting thing that a lot of herbalists would do at that time, and that was with any unidentified or unfamiliar fruit that had a firm round shape, they would just simply go ahead and give it the nickname apple until it could be better classified. But despite all that, we see that the fruit made its way over to Europe, where they tried to grow it. But the problem was that the climates in most parts of Europe were not the best for pineapple. And for nearly 200 years, we see that the first attempts failed miserably. In fact, it wasn't until Pietro de la Corte invented greenhouse horticulture in Leiden that things kind of started to take off. And from there, we see that in Leiden, they transported the pineapple fruits over to England, and then from there to the French regions in between 1719 and 1730. The first pineapples, interestingly enough, grown in England were grown in Dorney, Buckinghamshire, and this was also helped out in the whole horticultural process by the first advent of a heated stove to help grow the fruit that was built at the Chelsea Physic Garden in 1723. But still, this was not enough to satisfy the demand, especially of the nobility, for this coveted fruit. And people still preferred to go ahead and get their fruits from the colonies, but there was a problem with that. It was very hard to transport those fruits before they spoiled. However, if you were successful enough to get one that was not spoiled or had a little bit of damage to it, then you were very fortunate. And a lot of those people who were able to get that fruit, of course, were the nobility, the upper class, even some who were royalty. And we have some of those European monarchs such as Charles II, Louis XV, Catherine the Great, and King Ferdinand of Spain, to name a few, who adored the pineapple. But aside from this, we see that the pineapple at one point was so highly coveted that it would sell on average for about $8,000 in today's money. And that's just to buy it, not even to rent it. And if you were to rent a pineapple, then you would actually have to sign some form of agreement or even pay insurance on it to make sure that the pineapple returned to whoever was renting it out to you in practically pristine condition. What would they rent these pineapples for, you might ask? Simply an accessory. They were used to adorn tables, they were used to sit at the elbows of nobility at the dinner table, and in some cases people would rent them for an evening out on the town to just hold as an accessory. Not unlike how men do it today with certain wristwatches, or women do it today with pocketbooks or what have you. So it's kind of interesting to think about that in that regard. But we also see that the pineapple was so highly prized and so highly valued because of its scarcity and rarity in being available that it started to influence architecture. And we see this in a lot of places, public houses, courthouses, civic buildings, private homes, and perhaps, not only at St. Paul's Cathedral in London, but perhaps the most impressive of all is one in Falkirk, wherein you actually see a giant stone behemoth in the shape of a pineapple over this archway. And it is so big, in fact, that you could comfortably stay the night in this pineapple. Kind of crazy to think about, I know. But perhaps another reason that the pineapple was so highly valued was the fact of the matter, diet came into play. And you have to put yourself back in the shoes of the people in that time period. If you were able to have sweets available to you in the forms of cane sugar, well, that was expensive, so it was reserved for the upper class. If you were able to get honey or fruits, those were seasonal, whereas pineapples, being grown in greenhouses around the 17th and 18th centuries, they were still available, but they were very expensive. So there again, the average person in the populace, he's not going to be eating this unless somehow or another he gets into a greenhouse and he swipes one. So therefore, it was similar to what we talked about with the potatoes, where Armand Pontier actually made sure that the local populace could get a hold of the potatoes and grow them, except, well, the French nobility allowed that to happen. They were not about to allow anyone to have their pineapples. That must be made perfectly clear. But interestingly enough, another aspect as to why the pineapple gained some form of fame and being distinguished, this one is not exactly the most glowing review. Because similar to what we talked about with tomatoes and even possibly bananas, we see that some herbalists and theologians, doctors and the like, they came up with a theory that the pineapple was such an exotic fruit that eating such decadent fruits was almost considered tantalizing, exotic, titillating, and almost even sinful. And some people turned around and said, you know what? We already went through the tomato and the banana. Why not go ahead and add the pineapple to the list? And so they went ahead and said that the pineapple was possibly the fruit that Adam and Eve were tempted with in the Garden of Eden. But despite all that, we see that for a long time the pineapple became very popular. But by the time of the mid to late 18th century, its popularity and celebrity status started to fade, as with many things. And the reason is because that there were better means of transportation to make it easier and more available to get to the colonies, but also horticultural improvements and advancements had continued throughout those years, which meant that people could now grow them in their own gardens out in Buckinghamshire or wherever else you happen to live at. So at this point we see that the celebrity status of the pineapple starts to fade, but it still remains popular due to its sweet fruit. And so from that day to this, we see that the pineapple is still a rather expensive fruit, very highly sought after, and we see it adorning so many things. Now, some of you might more commonly see it in a can or in the form of juice. Some of us might see it on desserts. But hopefully, none of us will ever see pineapple adorning a pizza. That's where I draw the line. But in all seriousness, folks, it's with all that being said, it's crazy to think of the fact that, again, this cannot be stressed enough, with the ready availability of not just the pineapple, but so many products that we see in our supermarkets today, that at one point they were so highly coveted and sought after that they were only a food for the upper class rather than the common man. But regardless, maybe this video here will not only have entertained and educated you, but also make you appreciate pineapple as well as certain other foods we've talked about throughout this series a little bit more than what you did beforehand. And so with that being said, folks, this brings about the end of today's episode. As always, we want to thank you so much for coming along and supporting us on Facebook and YouTube. Your support is always greatly appreciated. If you haven't already, feel free to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And please feel free to join us for next week's video. But, before I forget to mention, when you subscribe to the channel, be sure to click that little bell icon, that dingy-dong bell, as Kent Rollins calls it, so you'll never miss an upload. But, with that being said, I've already taken enough time out of your day, so allow me to go ahead and get out of your hair. So, until next week, this is Isaac White signing off from the Crockett Tavern Museum, saying goodbye and God bless.